The Forbidden Door. Chapter 1. The Discovery. John and Emily Williams had just moved into their dream house. Nestled on the outskirts of a quiet little town, the house was spacious, filled with rustic charm, and surrounded by trees swaying gently in the breeze. They were thrilled with the place, exploring every corner and imagining the changes they would make to truly make it their own. However, amidst the excitement of moving in, something caught Emily's attention. At the end of a narrow hallway, there was a solid wooden door, unlike any of the others in the house. What made it different wasn't just the material but the large, old-fashioned lock that clung to it, its rust showing years of neglect. "Did you see this, John?" Emily asked, pointing at the door. John approached, frowning slightly. "This wasn't on the floor plan. I thought we had access to every room." Emily touched the cold wood, feeling a shiver run down her spine. "Why would anyone lock a door like this? What do you think is in there?" John tried turning the handle, but the lock wouldn't budge an inch. "Looks like we're going to need a key, or maybe a locksmith." He smiled, trying to ease the growing tension. In the days that followed, the presence of that door began to bother Emily more than she wanted to admit. At night, when everything was silent, she swore she could hear a faint sound, like a muffled whisper, coming from the other side. Whenever she mentioned it to John, he reassured her, saying it was just the old house settling or the creak of the pipes. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "We have to find out what's in there," she said one night, with a tone of determination that John wasn't used to hearing from her. John reluctantly agreed. "All right, tomorrow we'll call someone to get this thing open." As they lay down to sleep, Emily couldn't close her eyes. She lay on her back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind outside and trying to ignore the sounds that now seemed clearer than ever. Something behind that door was waiting to be discovered, something that perhaps was better left undisturbed. What do you think the couple will find behind that mysterious door? Subscribe and share to find out what's hidden. Chapter 2. The Whispering Shadows. The next morning, John and Emily called a locksmith to come and take a look at the door. As they waited, Emily couldn't help but hover near it, her eyes fixed on the rusted lock. There was something unnervingly magnetic about it, like it was daring her to turn back before it was too late. When the locksmith arrived, he was an older man with a grizzled beard and eyes that seemed to have seen more than they let on. He examined the lock with a puzzled expression, his fingers tracing its intricate details. "This is an old one," he muttered, more to himself than to them. "I haven't seen a lock like this in decades. Almost like it was meant to keep something in rather than keep people out." Emily exchanged a nervous glance with John. "Can you open it?" The locksmith nodded slowly. "I can, but I must warn you, sometimes, things are locked away for a reason." His words sent a chill through Emily, but her curiosity was too powerful to let fear hold her back. As the locksmith worked on the lock, Emily could swear the whispering grew louder. She glanced at John, but he seemed not to notice it. The sound was like a distant voice, almost pleading, but too faint to make out the words. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. With a click, the lock fell away. The door was now free, standing slightly ajar. The locksmith stepped back, his face pale. "My job's done here," he said hastily, almost stumbling as he turned to leave. "Good luck to you both." John hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open. A cold gust of air escaped from the dark room beyond, carrying with it the smell of damp and something else, something metallic, like old coins or blood. The room was shrouded in darkness, its corners hidden in shadows that seemed to shift as they stared. Emily reached for the light switch, but the bulb flickered weakly before dying completely. "Of course," she muttered. John pulled out his phone and switched on the flashlight, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into what appeared to be a basement they didn't know existed. "Should we go down there?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. John looked at her, his face a mix of uncertainty and determination. "We've come this far," he said. "We need to see what's down there." As they took the first steps down, the whispering grew louder, more distinct. This time, there were words that seemed to echo around them, overlapping and twisting into a message that was both inviting and terrifying. "Turn back, before it's too late." But it was already too late for them to turn back. "Are you ready to follow the couple into the darkness?" Subscribe and share to see what lies beneath the forbidden door. Chapter 3. The Hidden Room. John and Emily descended the creaky staircase, each step echoing like a heartbeat in the silence. The beam from John's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing cobwebs draped across the walls like threads of forgotten memories. The air grew colder with every step, and the metallic scent seemed to intensify, seeping into their lungs. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a small, stone-walled room. It was unlike anything they had seen in the rest of the house, cramped, ancient, and eerily empty. The only thing in the room was an old wooden chest, its lid sealed with thick iron clasps that looked as though they hadn't been opened in decades. "Do you think this is what the door was hiding?" Emily asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. She felt like an intruder in a place that had long been abandoned by time. John nodded, swallowing hard. "Only one way to find out." He reached down to unfasten the clasps, and as his fingers touched the cold metal, the whispering they had heard before suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was even more unnerving, like the house itself was holding its breath. When John finally lifted the lid, they both gasped. Inside the chest were old journals, dusty and yellowed with age, bound in cracked leather. Emily picked up the topmost one and opened it, revealing page after page filled with cramped, spidery handwriting. As she read the words, her face turned pale. These are diaries," she said, flipping through the pages. "They belong to the people who lived here before us." John leaned over her shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he read the scrawled entries. They spoke of strange occurrences, voices in the night, shadows that moved without cause, and a door that should never be opened. The last entry was dated nearly 50 years ago, and the final words were scribbled hastily. "Do not open the door. Do not let it out. It cannot be allowed to return." Emily's hands shook as she dropped the journal back into the chest. "What were they keeping in here, John? What's behind that door?" As if in response to her question, a cold breeze swept through the basement, extinguishing the light from John's phone. The darkness closed in around them, and for a moment, they were blind. Then, from somewhere within that pitch-black room, they heard it, a low growl, rumbling like a warning from the depths. "We need to get out of here," John said urgently, grabbing Emily's hand. But as they turned to leave, they found the staircase was no longer there. The walls had shifted, trapping them in the cold, stone chamber. The whispering started again, louder this time, filled with desperation and rage. It wasn't just one voice, it was many, all speaking at once, overlapping in a chaotic chorus of anger and sorrow. "We have to find another way out," Emily cried, her voice cracking with fear. But the room seemed to shrink around them, the shadows growing thicker, almost alive, reaching out as if to swallow them whole. What is lurking in the darkness of that hidden room? Subscribe and share to see what fate awaits John and Emily. Chapter 4. The Echoes of the Past. John and Emily stood in the center of the stone chamber, their breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. The darkness seemed to pulse around them, alive with a malevolent energy that filled the air with whispers, sighs, and fragmented words that twisted into half-heard warnings. "Do you hear that?" Emily asked, clutching John's arm. Her voice was barely a whisper, trembling with terror. "Yes," John replied, his grip tightening on her hand. "But we have to stay calm. There has to be another way out." He shined his phone's flashlight around the room, but the beam seemed weaker now, as if the darkness was swallowing the light. The walls, once solid in stone, seemed to shift and ripple like a mirage, and the corners of the room were now shrouded in shadows so deep they seemed to consume everything they touched. Then, they noticed something else, a small, hidden door in the far corner of the room, almost indistinguishable from the wall. It was even older than the chest, its wood warped and twisted, with strange symbols carved into its surface that neither of them could decipher. "Should we open it?" Emily asked, though her instincts screamed for her to run. "We don't have a choice," John said, his voice grim. "We need to get out of here, and this might be the only way." He reached for the handle, his hand trembling as he turned it slowly. The door creaked open to reveal another narrow passageway, this one slanting downward even further into the depths. Cold air rushed out from the darkness beyond, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of chanting, soft, rhythmic, and disturbingly familiar. "What is that sound?" Emily whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "It almost sounds like like someone calling for us. John shook his head. I don't know, but we have to keep moving. Staying here isn't an option. They stepped into the passageway, the walls pressing close on either side, as if the house itself were trying to suffocate them. As they descended deeper, the chanting grew louder, more distinct, and the words began to take shape in their minds, a language they did not recognize, yet somehow understood. Release us, free us from the darkness. The passage opened into another chamber, larger than the last, and this one was filled with old, crumbling statues. Each one was twisted in agony, their faces contorted in expressions of fear and despair. It was as if they were frozen in the moment of some terrible realization, their stone eyes locked on the center of the room. There, standing alone on a pedestal, was a large mirror, its surface black and reflective like polished obsidian. The whispers seemed to emanate from it, growing louder with every second, filling their minds with dread. Emily's eyes were drawn to the mirror, and as she stared into it, she saw not her own reflection, but the distorted face of a woman, her features twisted with rage, her eyes burning with an unearthly fire. Emily, don't look at it. John shouted, pulling her back, but it was too late. The face in the mirror smiled, a twisted grin that stretched far too wide. Its mouth opened, and from its depths, a voice echoed, not a whisper now, but a command. You have unleashed us. The mirror began to crack, fractures spiderwebbing across its surface as the room trembled violently. The chanting turned to screams, and the statues seemed to shift, their eyes following John and Emily with a hunger that made their blood run cold. Run! John yelled, dragging Emily back toward the passage they had come through, but the door they had entered was gone, replaced by a solid wall of stone. They were trapped. Will John and Emily survive the horrors they have unleashed? Subscribe and share to witness the terror unfold in the next chapter. Chapter 5. The Mirror's Curse. John and Emily were pressed against the cold stone wall, the mirror's fractured surface glowing with an eerie light that seemed to seep into the room like a fog. The whispers had turned into a chaotic symphony of voices, shrieking, pleading, cursing, as if countless souls were trapped in a constant loop of torment within the glass. Emily, we have to find a way to destroy that mirror, John said, his voice tight with desperation. Whatever we let out, it's coming from there. But how? Emily cried, panic lacing her words. The mirror, it feels like it's alive. John frantically scanned the chamber, his eyes locking onto an old iron rod half buried under a pile of debris. He grabbed it, feeling the cold metal burn into his palm as if it recognized his touch. Without a second thought, he raised the rod high and swung it down at the mirror with all his strength. The impact sent a shockwave through the room, the sound of shattering glass echoing like a thunderclap. The mirror cracked further, but instead of breaking, it seemed to absorb the blow. The light within it flared brighter, and suddenly, the room was filled with ghostly figures, pale, translucent beings that emerged from the mirror's depths. Their eyes were hollow, their faces twisted in expressions of agony and rage. They hovered around John and Emily, whispering words that made no sense yet seemed to pierce their minds directly. One of the figures, a tall man with hollow cheeks and eyes like empty pits, stepped forward. You have freed us, the figure intoned, his voice echoing from deep within the void. But the curse demands a price. What do you mean? Emily asked, her voice trembling. What price? The door was never meant to be opened, he replied. We were bound to it, to keep what lies beyond from reaching this world. Now that it is free, it must be contained, or it will consume you both. John stared at the figure, his face pale. What lies beyond? What have we unleashed? The ghostly figure's eyes seemed to bore into John's soul as he answered. The darkness. An ancient force that feeds on fear, pain, and despair. It was sealed behind that door to protect this house, and those who dwell within it. Emily's mind raced, the realization hitting her like a wave. The journals, they warned us. The people who lived here before, they were trying to keep it locked away. And now it knows your names, the ghostly figure said with a sad, knowing smile. It knows your fears. Suddenly, the walls of the chamber began to close in, the shadows stretching out like black tendrils, twisting and coiling towards John and Emily. The darkness seemed to pulse with a life of its own, feeding off their terror. Emily could feel it, like icy fingers crawling over her skin, whispering her deepest fears into her ears. "Run, Emily," John shouted, shoving her towards the last remaining exit. "We have to get out of this place, now." But as they bolted for the passage, the darkness surged forward, wrapping around John's ankle like a vice, pulling him back. He fell hard to the ground, his hands clawing at the stone floor as the shadows dragged him closer to the mirror. "John?" Emily screamed, reaching for him, but the darkness was too strong. "Go, Emily. You have to find a way to seal it," John yelled, his voice filled with both fear and determination. "You have to lock it away again, no matter what happens." The last thing she saw before the shadows consumed him was John's face, twisted in a look of resignation and defiance. Then, the darkness swallowed him whole, and Emily was left alone in the echoing chamber with the whispers all around her. Will Emily find a way to lock the darkness away, or is it already too late? Subscribe and share to see how the story concludes. Chapter 6. The Final Seal. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled through the darkened passageway, her mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. John was gone, swallowed by the darkness, and the only way to save him, the only way to stop whatever they had unleashed, was to find a way to seal it back inside the mirror. As she reached the main chamber, she saw the mirror's surface glowing like molten lava, cracks spreading across it like veins. The ghostly figures still hovered near, their faces twisted with both anguish and a silent plea for release. Emily knew that the only chance to save John was to act fast, to do something that the previous owners of this house could not. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse with desperation. "Tell me how to lock it away again. Tell me how to save him." One of the spirits, the same hollow-eyed man from before, drifted forward, his translucent form flickering like a flame caught in the wind. "The mirror is the key," he said, his voice echoing in the cold air. "It is the gateway in the prison. You must bind the darkness within it once more, but it demands a sacrifice, a soul willingly given." Emily's eyes widened, and she shook her head. "A sacrifice? There has to be another way." "There is no other way," the spirit said softly. "The darkness must be fed. To seal it, a life must be freely offered, one that the darkness desires most." Emily's heart shattered at the realization. She knew then that the darkness didn't just want any soul, it wanted John. It had targeted him from the moment they opened that forbidden door. And now, if she wanted to save him, she would have to make the ultimate choice. The mirror pulsed with a sickly light, and from its depths, she saw John's face appear, twisted in agony, trapped in the grip of the darkness that held him. His eyes met hers, and in them, she saw both fear and a plea, a silent call for her to do what had to be done. "I won't leave you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I can't let it take you, John." The room trembled as if reacting to her words, the shadows reaching out from the mirror, clawing at the air. Emily stepped closer to the pedestal, feeling the darkness tug at her soul, pulling her towards that inevitable decision. She took a deep breath, her voice steadying as she spoke the words that would seal their fate. "If it's a soul you want," she said, her voice cracking but resolute, "then take mine. I offer myself willingly in John's place." The moment the words left her lips, the mirror's light flared blindingly bright, and the darkness seemed to recoil, howling in fury. The ghostly figures around her bowed their heads as if in reverence, their forms shimmering and fading into the light. The chamber filled with a blinding white glow, and Emily felt the icy grip of the darkness release its hold on John. "No, Emily!" John screamed as he was thrust out of the mirror's grasp, stumbling to the floor as the room began to shake violently. Emily felt her strength draining, her vision dimming as the darkness flowed towards her, wrapping around her like a shroud. She locked eyes with John one last time, a sad smile touching her lips. "Live for both of us," she whispered. "Close the door, and never open it again." With a final surge of power, the mirror's surface reformed, the cracks sealing themselves shut as the darkness was drawn back inside, bound by Emily's sacrifice. The room fell silent, the whispers fading to nothing as the last of the spirits disappeared into the void. John rushed to where Emily had stood, but she was gone, her form erased, her soul now part of the mirror's eternal prison. All that remained was the cold, unbroken glass, reflecting his own haunted face. The door at the top of the stairs creaked open on its own, as if welcoming him to leave. He turned towards it, his heart heavy with grief, knowing that Emily had saved him at the cost of her own life. He knew that he could never stay in this house, not after everything it had taken from them. John walked slowly up the stairs, closing the forbidden door behind him. He locked it, securing it with the rusty old padlock, and placed the key on a shelf out of reach, where it would stay hidden, gathering dust, never to be used again. As he turned away from the door, he heard one last whisper, soft and distant, echoing from deep within the house. "Goodbye, John." The end.